Hi, welcome back to Risk Management. Today's topic is Inferior Data Part 6, the final part in our series of Inferior Data lectures. We've been talking throughout this series on observational studies and the weaknesses that come up in them in contrast with experimental studies such as randomized controlled trials, RCTs. What we'll talk about today are two final case studies of observational studies, namely whether coffee usage reduces Parkinson's disease, a neurodegenerative disorder, and two, we'll look at the original studies on whether cigarette smoking causes lung cancer, which interestingly enough are observational studies. Finally, we'll conclude today by briefly repeating the warning that extrapolation needs to be cautiously done, not just in the case of experimental studies as we pointed out before, but also with observational studies, perhaps even more so. Let's get started. I want to remind ourselves of this slide that we've seen throughout this lecture series about the difference between experimental study designs and observational study designs. That experimental studies are typically necessary in order to yield knowledge of causation, and thus risk, as opposed to observational studies, which may provide us and inform us with hypotheses about risks, but ultimately may leave us unsatisfied that we have causal knowledge, and thus still leave us in the realm of uncertainty, as we discussed back on day one of this course. One of the things about experimental studies that's important to recall is that they balance out confounders and reduce the risk of chance or bias interfering in our knowledge of actual causation. On the other hand, observational studies don't necessarily eliminate such confounders, at least not all of them, nor do they always balance out chance or the possibility of reverse causation. So in both of these examples, we need to be cautious that we in fact gain causal knowledge and don't simply revert to asserting opinion where we actually don't have fact. So let's turn to the question of, does coffee drinking prevent Parkinson's disease? This is a study that was done recently by Ross in 2000. And what they did was they looked back in the 1960s, and there had been a study of Japanese American men who had enrolled in something called the Honolulu Heart Program, a study dealing with heart conditions back in the 1960s. And there were 8,000 people who were enrolled in this, and they had a detailed 24-hour-a-day intake monitoring where most of their daily activities were monitored in great detail for 3 years. There was then a less thorough follow-up monitoring in 1971 consisting mostly of questionnaires. The advantages of this study are severalfold. Number one, the median age of these men in this study was 53. And what's nice to know about that is that Parkinson's disease has both early and late onsets. Early onsets are people like Michael J. Fox, the actor, who contracted it at a young age. That's typically due to genetic conditions. But it's thought that from other studies that have been done, late onset Parkinson's disease coming in middle or elderly age is typically due to environmental factors instead of genetic factors. So by knowing that the men in the study who were enrolled in this heart study were of an average age of 53, it was concluded fairly reliably that most of the conditions that they had, if they in fact contracted Parkinson's disease, would be due to environmental factors and not their genetics. So that confounder was controlled for by the design of this observational study. Number two, the study was a prospective study in the sense that it measured over the course of 3 years going forward the usage of caffeine for these individuals. Now that's nice because it doesn't create the possibility of recall bias. Recall bias often comes up as a problem in observational study designs because if you ask after the fact, how much coffee did you drink over the last 3 years, people's memories tend often to be errant, and they'll give you false information about how much coffee they actually drank. In a prospective study, you're asking week by week or even day by day, such as in this case, how much coffee was being drunk. Much less risk of error in such cases as opposed to asking 3 years henceforth. Number three, this had unbiased Parkinson's disease diagnosis occurring in this study. When in 2000 they started evaluating these men for follow-up, some 30 years after the study had initially been done, the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease was not done by the study authors, the people who were looking for this association. Rather, individuals in the study were referred for independent diagnosis of Parkinson's disease by outside doctors. This allows for a blinding and a control in the study so that exuberant and potentially biased findings of Parkinson's disease where none might actually exist wouldn't taint the study results. And fourth, this was a longitudinal study, which is a very nice, powerful part of the design if you are in fact going to use an observational study. The same people were tracked both for exposure and outcomes. That's not always the case in an observational study, that the same person whose caffeine intake, for example, is measured is the same person whose Parkinson's disease is diagnosed. Sometimes there's things called cross-sectional studies or cohort studies or case control studies, all of which try to match and guess who got Parkinson's disease versus who got coffee intake and try to assume that sort of relationship. Here there's no doubt. We have the understanding of who drank coffee, who didn't, how much they drank, and who got Parkinson's and who didn't, specifically among the same population of people. What did they find in the study? Well, they found that Parkinson's incidence, there were 102 total cases of Parkinson's out of these 8,000 men who had been studied in the 1960s by 2000, that their Parkinson's incidence was between 2 to 3 times higher among the lowest quintile of coffee consumers as opposed to the highest quintile. And that was statistically significant result at 1 in 1,000. So a very, very statistically significant result. In fact, if you look at the chart here of this, there was actually a 6-fold relative risk increase in Parkinson's disease between non-drinkers of coffee and those in the highest quintile of coffee consumption. Here on the left-hand part of the axis, you see the cumulative incidence of Parkinson's disease. On the horizontal axis is the number of years elapsed since the study started, and you can see that for the non-drinker, there's a very high 3 to 3.5% incidence of Parkinson's disease, as opposed to those who drink the heaviest amounts of coffee having a very low incidence. And what's very nice is there's sort of a gradient curve here going on, right? There's a linear response to Parkinson's that you might expect. The more coffee I drink, if in fact coffee is curing Parkinson's disease, it tends to be that there's a linear response. If I drink no coffee, I have the highest rate of Parkinson's. If I drink a little coffee, there's some less. A little more coffee, there's some less Parkinson's. A little more coffee, there's some less Parkinson's. So the dose curve is absolutely what you might expect if you in fact had some sort of causal relationship between coffee and a reduction in Parkinson's disease. There are, however, some concerns with any observational study that have to be taken into account and critiqued. Can we simply conclude from what I've shown you thus far that yes, coffee use reduces the risk of Parkinson's disease? Well, not necessarily. Let's point out some of the weaknesses of this study. Number one, there's potential measurement bias in this study. The coffee usage was only measured very carefully during the 1965 to 68 phase of this study. Never again was coffee and usage carefully analyzed for these individuals, even in 1971, where a follow-up questionnaire was distributed to these men. They only were asked about how much coffee consumption they had had during the previous week, and nobody asked the question, was it caffeinated or decaffeinated? The assumption being that it's the caffeine in the coffee that actually cures Parkinson's. The median time to Parkinson's disease diagnosis after the study started in 1965 was about 16 to 17 years. So that would have been about 1981 to 1982 was the average time that somebody would have been diagnosed with Parkinson's who participated in this study. Of course, the last information that anyone had in this study about coffee usage was back in 1971. Maybe people quit, maybe people picked up drinking coffee or so forth in the interim. You don't have any continuous flow of information about coffee usage from 1965 all the way up through 2000 when this study was actually produced. And because you lack that continuous knowledge, you don't know about sort of washouts where people stopped using coffee or wash-ins where people started using coffee. There's other potential confounders, of course, that could come up here when looking at this study. Number one, genetics. It could be that genes predispose people to drinking coffee, and the same genes also predispose people to not getting Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease. And so therefore, you might have some sort of confounding effect here in terms of genetics, even though it was attempted to be controlled for in the sense that it was an older age of men who enrolled in the study. Number two, there could be lifestyle confounders going on here. People who drink coffee may tend to be active people, and active people may also be the kind of people who don't get Parkinson's disease. And so you might not be able to rule out lifestyle as a component in this. There's other potential confounds, of course, things like smoking or alcohol, which had the same measurement bias problems as coffee consumption in this case did too. So you can't rule out things like that where that might occur. Other potential confounders like chocolate, which contains trace amounts of caffeine, or other forms of caffeine like tea drinking or something like that. These were Japanese American men, and their tea drinking may not have been measured accurately. So in any event, what we obviously can't say is that all confounders, unlike a randomized trial, have been ruled out in this case. There's also always the question, remember directionality when it comes to causation, that the reverse is true. Perhaps latent pre-Parkinson's disease neurological changes occur, and whatever those changes in the brain are cause people to stop drinking coffee also. And so as a result, the reverse is always possible as a case when you have an observational study design such as this one, which can't rule that out. So even the study authors in this case, in their final paragraph, were honest about this when they published this article in the Journal of the American Medical Association. They said, most important, the observational nature of this study design that we've undertaken prevents us from concluding that coffee or caffeine directly protect against the development of Parkinson's disease. In other words, we can't prove based on this study and know based on this study alone that Parkinson's disease can be avoided through use of caffeine or coffee. However, they point out, the prospective assessment of exposures and unbiased case-finding methods that we use strengthened our observational study design and their unique strengths that enhance the importance of the findings. The possibility that caffeine has a protective effect against Parkinson's disease should be investigated further with future epidemiological, clinical, and basic scientific research. In other words, they're calling for more study of this issue, probably preferentially experimental study of this issue in randomized trials, saying we think we've created enough evidence that it's worth going to the time, cost, and effort of creating an effective body of knowledge about this issue, particularly for a devastating disease like Parkinson's that might be avoided cheaply and with few side effects, such as coffee usage. Okay, that's one example of an observational study where the results couldn't be given definitive causal weight, even though they're quite impressive, control for a lot of confounders and biases. It doesn't rule out everything, and therefore the study authors had to make the caveat that they have not given us causal knowledge by this study. But that makes us turn to the granddad of all observational studies, which is the question of, does smoking cause lung cancer? And this is a study conducted by Sir Richard Dall and Sir Bradford Hill, two British physicians who were looking at this question back in the 1950s. Originally, this question had been raised among Nazi scientists in Germany, and initial data had been yielded by Nazi scientists who were environmentalists. Hitler was an environmentalist, looking at the question of, does smoking cause lung cancer? And the Nazis had in fact rationed cigarettes in Nazi Germany in the Weimar Republic as a result of concerns that it was causing lung cancer. But Dall and Hill were really the first to very publicly do their study. And in 1954, they did the following. They created an observational study design in which they sent questionnaires to about 60,000 UK British physicians, men and women, on October 31st, 1951, inquiring about their cigarette and pipe usage, past and present, and the amounts that people smoked. 41,000 of them actually responded, which is quite a great participation rate among this population. Over 2/3 of the people actually responding to the survey that was sent out to them voluntarily. And in those results, Dall and Hill chose only to investigate men over the age of 35, of which there were about 25,000 in the study. In March of 1954, they began their study, and they found that 36 responders had died of lung cancer since they sent out the survey in 1951. So they wanted to do a study to see, is this association that we suspect between cigarette smoking and lung cancer causal? There were some strengths to their study design. Obviously, this is an observational study, one that's weaker in design and strength than an experimental study, which would randomize and cause people either to be forced to smoke or not to smoke in random groups, would actually yield us knowledge. So nonetheless, in this case, there were two strengths of Dahl and Hill's observational study that are worth pointing out. Number one, it was prospective. It was a study that went forward and asked doctors, how much are you smoking, something that they wouldn't necessarily get wrong, and how much will you be smoking, where they were followed up with at intervals. This is useful because it avoids recall bias, which was the issue we had before when we were talking about coffee and Parkinson's disease. It's hard to remember in the past how much you smoked 3-4 years on, and that's particularly the case if someone has passed away from lung cancer and you're asking the family how much did they smoke, where it's secondhand knowledge. Therefore, a prospective study design which asks you what are you smoking now and traces you over time going forward is a useful form of study. Second, this study was longitudinal. It tracked specific individuals' usages and the outcomes for those same specific individuals. Therefore, you don't have to guess based on Dahl and Hill's study about matching how much someone smoked and the case outcome, whether or not they got lung cancer. You can actually track that specific relationship for specific individuals, and that's a nice study design. Well, here's the actual photocopied page out of Dahl and Hill's results, and what you'll see here is that they observed no deaths among non-smokers for lung cancer, even though they expected more, and if the population had sort of been randomly distributed in terms of who got lung cancer and who didn't, and it had nothing to do with smoking. And what they found also was that there were significant numbers of people who got lung cancer and had passed away from it as a result of smoking, or at least while they were smoking, I should say. And they put this into a graph form where they looked at the ratio between the observed deaths and the expected deaths. That is, the number of deaths you might expect if lung cancer were just randomly distributed among the population as opposed to among smokers. And what you see is, again, a gradient curve here. Non-smokers, there's no numbers of deaths, whereas relative to the expected number of deaths, there's a very high rate of lung cancer, well above the expected 100% average, almost a twofold increase, even in 3 to 4 years after their study started, of smokers smoking 25 or more cigarettes a day. So what you can see here from this is a gradient curve, and it's done in a longitudinal prospective study, a fairly powerful sort of design if we are using observational studies. This was enough to prompt the U.S. Surgeon General a couple of years later to state a new official position of the U.S. Public Health Service, that a causal relationship had been established between smoking and lung cancer, cautioning Americans, leading to warning labels on packs and so forth. Notice, there was no experimental design here. There was no experiment done. So we are still in the realm of observational data, but because it was a fairly strong data design, people immediately jumped to the conclusion that smoking causes lung cancer. Well, this didn't please everybody, and in fact, some people threw up their hands and objected about this, namely our good old friend R.A. Fisher, the statistician who had invented randomization back in 1923, rode to the rescue again of randomization and experiment in 1958. He published a study where he pointed out the following, that if this proposed relationship is that a propensity to smoke causes lung cancer, he decided to look at studies of monozygotic twins, identical twins. And what he found in this, when he looked at these twin studies, was that there was a potential confounder, a positive confounder that could have come in, namely genetics. He found statistically significant associations for twin studies, which the twins share the same DNA, with a propensity to smoke and a likelihood of getting lung cancer. Therefore, what R.A. Fisher wrote in his article was that Dr. Bradford Hill, while admitting that the evidence of association between smoking and lung cancer found by his unit did not amount to proof of causation, has emphasized he doesn't know what else it can be. That's what Hill and Dahl said. What else could this be if not smoking? What Fisher says is the facts that we have reported do show, however, that the choice is not as narrow as has been thought. Fisher's pointing out there are still confounders even given the strength of study design that Dahl and Hill chose to use, a longitudinal prospective observational study that they hadn't ruled out all confounder potentials, such as, for example, genetic predisposition to smoke and genetic predisposition to lung cancer in the same person. The fact is the following: there has never been, and likely now never will be, because of self-fulfilling ethical considerations, a randomized experiment to demonstrate that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer. Do we have enough evidence yet to conclude it or not? Well, we'll come back to this topic in a future lecture where we talk a little bit more about causation and the Hill criteria, which are factors that we consider in determining whether we actually know causation or not. What has been, however, lacking from this is the experimental data. Coming back to our final conclusion about this, to see this slide yet one more time, experimental studies give us causal knowledge. Observational studies, even very strong ones, don't balance out all confounders, chance, and bias, and therefore leave themselves susceptible to the possibility of accusation that they have not proven causation. Okay. Finally, I want to just make a few brief comments about, just as we had that caveat that for experimental studies we should avoid extrapolation from certain circumstances to others, such as in animal studies predicting for humans, we need to avoid extrapolation in observational studies too. A nice example of this comes from Steve Levitt, the Freakonomics author, who has a lot of observational work that he does in economics. One example is where he did a study looking at a bagel man who would deliver bagels all over Washington, D.C., and drop them off where he would leave the bagels in the lunchrooms and leave a tip jar box asking people to be honest on an honesty system and put the money in the jar for whatever bagels they helped themselves to. And there was a certain amount of unavoidable theft that went on whenever this occurred. What the bagel man noticed was that certain firms with higher stressors, such as law firms and telecom companies, tended to have higher theft levels of bagels in the lunchroom. They also tended to have higher theft, actually, interestingly, in the administrative or senior executive levels of the buildings, where there were 3 tiers in the same building, and he dropped off in 3 different lunchrooms. The morale of employees, which he sort of subjectively measured for different companies based on conversations with employees as he went in and out of the buildings delivering bagels, was also measured. The size of a company was measured. Whether there was lower or higher local unemployment rates was a measured thing that Levitt looked at in the studies. He also looked at things like bad weather days or Thanksgiving and Christmas, when people might have been more tempted to help themselves deferentially to bagels without tipping for them. He also noted that even around patriotic holidays like 4th of July, that people tended to be there tended to be less thievery than on other days. What I want to caution in all of this, though, is what does this tell us? It tells us about people's proclivity to steal bagels. It doesn't necessarily tell us anything about white-collar theft. In other words, we don't necessarily know how executives are going to act in accounting fraud or other things like that just based on their bagel theft practices. And that's something we need to be cautious about. If what we're saying is we can learn something about corporate practice through about lunchroom practice, we need to be cautious about extrapolating beyond what we know to what we don't without further evidence. Okay, that's enough for this rather lengthy lecture for today. We've covered quite a bit, and we hopefully have brought to a conclusion the idea that inferior data coming from inferior study design need to be handled as such. Not that they give us causal knowledge, but that they build hypotheses warranting perhaps further study, but in fact still leaving us in the realm of uncertainty. I'll see you on the chat boards and in our next class.